You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was from our live event, An Evening with Brian McLaren, on his most recent book, Life After Doom, on February 21st, 2025. Thanks for tuning in.
But what a beautiful spirit tonight, and just a lot of friendliness, and a lot of you know each other, and some of you are meeting some new friends. Whoever you are, whatever your background, you're welcome here. I sure feel welcomed by just the spirit in this place. When you write a book called Life After Doom, the word doom tends to suck the air out of the room. Several people, the book came out last May, and several people have called me since about a month ago and said, shoot, why were you right? It feels like we're having to live through this. When the book came out, I've had a very intense reactions to the book. Some of you would know Rainn Wilson, also known as Dwight Schrute. But Rainn had me on his podcast a couple months ago. It just came out this week. And I don't know how much of this ended up on the podcast because I haven't listened to the whole thing yet. But when we were talking in his studio, he just said how much he struggled with the book. Like he felt like it was good for him, but it was hard, really hard for him to read. That's what I've heard mostly from older folks. From younger folks, the most common response I've gotten to the book is it's almost like somebody sent them a script, but it's relief. Relief because I feel the problems we're in are very, very serious. The trouble we're in is deep. And it feels like nobody ever treats it as if it's as serious as I think it is. So it was a relief to have somebody say, I think we're actually in a mess, So what I'd like to do tonight is kind of explore a couple of ideas that I think will be helpful to you as you're trying to cope with what we're seeing going on in our world. I'm going to talk for 40 minutes or so max, and then we'll have a little break, and then a lot of time for questions. And I'm especially interested in the kind of questions you want to ask. I'm going to throw out some teasers to get you thinking. One of my mentors used to say that learning is not the consequence of teaching. Learning is the consequence of thinking. And so what I hope will happen is that I'll give you some things that will get you thinking. And I'd like to begin with a story about my Grandpa Smith, who I wish you all could have known. He died when he was 84. He was born in 1893, and he was a big part of my life through my childhood up until my early teenage years. He spent his whole life in upstate New York, and that's where I was born. And every February, from the time I was about 4 or 5 years old up through all of my childhood, growing up in upstate New York, my parents had the good sense to take their vacation in February and go down to Southwest Florida, where I now live. Probably that's why I live there, because we took vacations there when I was so small. And on one vacation, in our old 1957 Pontiac Sky Chief, my mom and dad were in the front seat. Grandpa and Grandma were in the back seat with my brother and me squirming and squiggling and everything else. And I have this memory. At this visit, I'm thinking I was 7, 8 years old, and maybe 9 years old. And we're driving through Central Florida. And I saw something I'd never seen before. Do y'all know what a pump jack is? It looks like a little sandpiper bobbing up and down, made of metal, and it's pumping out oil or gas, natural gas sometimes. But the old ones, they were pumping out oil. And it turns out there was oil in Central Florida. But I'd never seen one of those things before. So I said, "Hey, Grandpa, what's that?" And he said, "That's a pump jack." And he said, "That's where we get oil. That's how we get gasoline to run our car." And the first question that came to my mind is I said, well, what happens when they pump it all out? Like in my mind, it was obvious that anything that's finite, you could pump it all out. And my grandpa, I could tell like it was a question he never thought of before. And he said, and my grandpa was a very sincere, very conservative Christian. So he said, "Oh, the Lord put enough in to last us until Christ returns." And it was, my grandpa was utterly sincere, utterly, completely sincere. And so I didn't argue with him, but I just remember, I think the reason I remember this is I revered him, and I remember in my mind sort of saying, he's wrong about that, I don't think that makes sense. But I didn't argue with him because I knew what a lovely human he was. But I remember as a boy thinking, I see the world differently than he does. And I look back on that now. I don't think I realized all this at 8 or 9, but because that memory is so strong, I think back on it and I think born in the 1890s, never had a passport, only left the state of New York to go with us to Florida. To him, the world was unimaginably big. And it was a reasonable thought that you would never be able to pump out the oil of a planet so huge. And me, a little boy, I had already seen those first photographs from of the Earth from space. And for me, the Earth was a finite blue ball spinning in a very, very big space. And I could sort of see the whole Earth in my mind's eye. And we just grew up in two different worlds. And I think there are still some people who live in my grandfather's world of different ages. I think it just has to do with the amount of education, the amount of travel, the amount of things they're interested in reading, the shows they turn on or turn off on television, But I think we live in different worlds still today. But I think more and more of us were aware that we live on a crowded planet and that we're at a time of unique challenges relating to this planet. And I think the process of coming to terms with what it means to live on a finite, crowded planet, I think that it is a somewhat traumatic experience for people. It's a disturbing, undoing experience for people. That's why many people, they take a step into it and then they step back. But what I've experienced in my own adult life is this awareness that our relationship with the earth is unsustainable. And yet we're very committed to our current exploitive, destructive relationship with the earth. And so there is a process that I think we go through. People often call it the U process, but it's the process of descent, of letting go of our assumptions, letting go of our old ways of seeing things. It's a difficult process. A friend of mine said, letting go is the gift that nobody wants. But when you lose your illusions, that's called disillusionment, but it's also called enlightenment. And so it's a descent, it's a loss, but it's also a necessary step of gain. And then we reach a place of letting be, where we've let go of so many things. We find ourselves saying, I used to be a lot smarter than I am now. Or I used to know a lot more than I do now. And we find ourselves saying, I just don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to make of it. The ability to, not in any false humility, actual honesty, saying, I don't know. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know what's going to happen. Letting go, letting be. If we allow ourselves to let be for long enough, I think some of the things we lose, a little bit like losing the roof off of a building, we lose some of our old assumptions and then we see the stars. New things become visible to us in that letting be, and that leads us into that letting come phase. And then new things come that then set us free to function in the world, respond to the world in new ways. And so I structured this book around this process. Now, this letting go process, though, is where we're going to begin. Dropping our defenses against a reality we don't really want and we didn't really ask for. When I use the word doom, I don't mean the end of the world. I'm not talking about Mad Max or, Don't Look Up. How many of you saw Don't Look Up? I mean, what a powerful movie. It just feels like it's the news today. But when I use the word doom, I mean, doom is the feeling that comes when we realize that our problems have grown bigger than our solutions. Some psychologists use a term called fright without escape. And when we experience fright without escape, when we, for the first time, have seriously entertained the thought that our problems are bigger than our solutions, for many of us, that is a turning point in our lives. I know as I wrote this book, even though I knew all the data and all the rest, I felt that I was breaking up with something that I intellectually didn't actually believe, but I realized I still had a crush on it. And it's called the myth of progress. The idea that with our technology and our intelligence and our governments and our economies, things will get better and better. And when you have to let go that assumption, for the first time in your life, whether you're 18 years old or 88 years old, it's a disruptive experience. I wrote in the book, doom is a kind of pre-traumatic stress disorder that arises when our old normal is deteriorating and no new normal has come into view. For our purposes, it isn't a single catastrophic event at some point in the future. Instead, it is the emotional and intellectual experience shared by all who realize the dangerous future into which we are presently plunging ourselves, our descendants, and our fellow creatures. And one way to talk about this danger is to talk about 4 interrelated crises. A lot of experts are using the term polycrisis or multi-crisis to describe our current situation. What they mean by this is when you have a crisis, multiple crises, and each one makes the others harder to solve, you're in a unique situation. Let me just mention 5 of these major problems we're trying to solve. One is the crisis of our relationship with the planet. How do we live with the planet? And we're coming to realize that we're in a relationship with the planet called overshoot. And we've been in it not just for decades, not just for centuries. We've been in a relationship of overshoot with the planet for millennia. Overshoot means we suck out more resources than the earth can replenish, and we pump out more wastes than the earth can detoxify. Now, you might think, well, that's a recent problem. No, if you start studying ancient civilizations, you find out that in civilization after civilization, they sucked out all the nutrients from the soil where they were, right? They farmed the soil. They didn't know how to care for the soil. And so they would experience overshoot, or they cut down all the trees. And when you cut down the trees, your microclimate changes and your crops don't do so well. I'm just in area after area. They caught all the fish. They killed all the game. we've been living with overshoot. But here's the thing that's happened in my lifetime and in the lifetime of many of us in this room. We human beings spread around the entire planet. We always used to be able to overshoot one area and then move to another. Guess what, folks? Not many places that are welcoming immigrants to come in and exploit their land anymore. And so we're in this place where we're having to think about our relationship with the planet. Second, how do we seek peace with each other? For many centuries, the way we sought peace was through domination. If men dominate women, if adults dominate children, if the rich dominate the poor, if white people dominate people of color, there are people around the world, if the nobility dominates the commoners. We had a lot of different ways to describe domination as the way to peace. But listen, there are some very powerful and rich people in the world today who believe that domination is the only way to peace. You know who I'm talking about. And listen, when your only way of building peace is through domination, through creating some group of people to unite us against them with hostility and scapegoating, you end up pumping. It's just like ecological overshoot. Instead of just pumping toxins or too much carbon dioxide or whatever into a physical environment, we're pumping more and more hatred and fear and resentment into the social environment. It's stupid, but we've been doing it for a long time. And now we have methods to make sure that we can keep pumping that fear and hostility into people so that multiple times a day we get our next hit of outrage. We're like in this giant psychological experiment, and we're the rats. How do we distribute power? And we have been in this couple 100-year experiment of democracy where we said, let's distribute power more and more equitably. But there's always been a counter movement to this. And man, are we seeing it now. The concentration of wealth and power. And remember, wealth is a form of power. Not everybody uses their wealth as power, but all it takes is a few of the richest people in the world. I know it's hard to imagine this happening, but imagine if some of the richest people in the world decided to buy newspapers and decided to buy cable news networks and decided to buy social media. I know you can't imagine this happening. Somebody would stop them, but imagine that they got away with it. And then, of course, what they can do then is they can make sure that they manage the algorithms and they slant the headlines and they cover some things and not cover others in a way that helps accumulate even more power and protect even more of their power. How do we define profit? And we have lived in a society for several hundred years now where we define profit as individually hoarded wealth. It may surprise you, but there are a whole lot of people for a whole lot of human history that thought never, ever, ever crossed their mind. They didn't run their lives or their civilizations on individually hoarded wealth at all. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek said some years ago, and I think he was quoting somebody else, but I heard it from him. He said, "It is easier for us to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." And this is we're shaped by our economic system, how we shape purpose and meaning. In the past, we've been able to rely on our religions to help us develop a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. But when our religions are depending on the same powerful and wealthy people for their donations as are exerting so much power in other places, and for many other reasons as well, we find ourselves in a time when our religious institutions seem to be failing us on many different levels. And a surface problem of this, of course, is climate change. Now, I want you to I hope for the rest of your lives, whenever you hear climate change, that you'll say, yeah, that's a real problem. It's actually a symptom of the deeper problem of overshoot. It's maybe one of our most serious symptoms of overshoot right now. But even if we didn't have climate change, overshoot is a deadly, deadly problem, right? But it's not like we have an ecological problem. We have a civilizational problem. Human beings don't have to live in overshoot with the earth. But we've built a civilization that requires us to live in overshoot with the earth. And so we human beings are having to figure out, how do we extract ourselves from the assumptions of a civilization to imagine a new way of living with the planet, and a new way of working for peace, and a new way of understanding what profit is, and a new way of distributing power. And we're involved in this kind of deep, deep shift, and it's messy. And because of our love for the earth and our concern for the earth, we're aware, you've probably all heard the term tipping points. You're aware that scientists have given us a number of tipping points, things that when you push them so far, things never go back to the way they were. And we could talk about some of those if you'd like, but it's fascinating and it's terrifying when you understand the various tipping points, many of which we maybe have crossed irrevocably, and the data just hasn't caught up to it yet. But many, many of them, our toes are hanging over the edge, right? And but here's the thing, when I wrote this book, I'm a science nerd. I love all the science. I love learning about glaciers and reflectivity of ice and aerosols in the air. I love learning about all that stuff. I'm into algae. I like it all. I'm interested in it all. But here's the interesting thing you find out. Everybody's a specialist. The people we need out there doing work are specialists. And very few of them have the time and energy to look up from their specialization to see what another specialist is doing and another. And the people who end up doing this usually are journalists. Journalists are usually the ones who try to learn from a lot of specialists and get the big picture of what's going on. And the people who do this, I don't think there's a single exception. The people who start looking across specialties, trying to put together the big picture, what they start talking about is that long before we will experience ecological collapse, we'll experience civilizational collapse, because our civilization, we think of it as being unshakable. But don't we just feel, even in the last 4 weeks, how things that you never thought would be shaken could be shaken? And so this is part of this letting go, realizing I thought these things would never be shaken. Maybe they could be shaken. And when we go through this process, we have to face the realities of the possibilities of civilizational collapse. I'm not going to say too much about that, except to say that sometimes, first of all, I think we all could agree with this. Every civilization of the past has ended. But we never think ours will. They didn't either. Right. Some civilizations collapse suddenly. Many collapse, the way people describe it, is in a stair-step fashion. Civilizations reach a level of complexity to solve more and more problems. But eventually something happens where they can't keep solving problems, or they don't keep solving problems. And when you stop solving problems, then you lose some of the complexity. And then you might have a fall down one flight of stairs. And then you hang on in that level and you get used to it and you think, oh, well, we hit the bottom. And then you fall down another flight of stairs. And so, when people talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire, for example, it's kind of hard to pick a date because they went down several flights of stairs. I'll give you one date a little later. But so one of the things I try to do in the book is take all of the research that's being done on this and try to create 4 scenarios that, one of these is surely in our future. There could be more than one of these in our future. In other words, you could have one at a time. But here are the 4 scenarios that I think we face. The first is collapse avoidance. This is the idea that we could turn things around fast enough and radically enough to keep our ecological crises from pushing our civilization into a state of collapse. And I'll just tell you, among people who are really focused on climate change, this is one of my special interests, right? Among folks who are interested in climate change, this has not been an easy year because the threat of regime change in the United States would have ramifications around the earth for everyone doing work on climate. And so a lot of people who before were sure that we'd be able to achieve collapse avoidance are not as sure. And many of them can't talk about it because they're afraid of scaring people. And the second is collapse rebirth. And this would say there will be some sort of collapse, but in the process of collapse, we'll wake up before the whole thing is blown to smithereens, and we will find ways to salvage what can be salvaged so there could be a rebirth. Second scenario. Third scenario, there will be a collapse. The collapse will go so far that the people who survive will probably survive more like 300 years ago than like now, right? That there'll be things that will be lost. That's collapse survival. And then collapse extinction. If we burn all of the fossil fuels that are owned by the fossil fuel companies right now, we will send the Earth into a temperature death spiral that will not only end up wiping out humanity, but would wipe out a huge percentage of land-based and a lot of sea-based life. I mean, it's easy to predict. We know how much oil there is. We know how much it will accelerate our temperatures. We know what will happen. And so that scenario is out there. And people don't like to talk about it. This is the reality that we face. And right now you're thinking, man, this was not how I want to spend a Friday night. Because when we talk about these things, it causes a lot of stress in our nervous system. And your nervous system might be feeling it right now. I hope you're not. I hope you're able to just sort of think about this on one level and not let it really freak you out. But look, as somebody who's been really freaked out, if you are feeling that way, I understand. I think of the 8 billion people on this earth, there's some number, tens of millions, that have freaked out. I think that every day there are a few million more. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 10 or 15 years, it might get up to 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion of Earth's people have let go and started to feel that in their nervous system, they've decided, I'm going to face these realities. Because we have built-in mechanisms to keep us from facing them. Denial, there's a whole set of biases. If you're interested, I have a little ebook I wrote about biases, ways that help us keep reality at bay. My friend and colleague, Father Richard Rohr, often defines contemplation as meeting all the reality we can bear. Because what we filter out an awful lot of reality that we don't want to face, right? But I think one of the things that's going to happen, and I'm not trying to put in a plug just for Way Collective, but I'm saying communities like Wave Collective, and many of you are part of faith, spiritual communities, other kinds of communities that do this. I think one of the things we're going to need like never before in the coming years is communities that will accept people whatever they believe or don't believe, and will accept people wherever they're coming from in different ways, but will say, if you're interested in learning how to regulate your nervous system, we have some ancient, time-tested practices to help you do this. And we're not going to require you to learn all of our jargon and lingo. We're going to give you the cookies on the bottom shelf. We're going to help you learn and practice these things because people are struggling to regulate their nervous systems. They're just doing it here in the United States because of what's happening politically. Just the politics is enough to throw us into dysregulation. And of course, in many ways, the politics is a lovely distraction from far bigger problems, right? That the politicians aren't even talking about, which is part of the problem. But here's a way I'd like to offer, just in very simple terms, for you to think about what it means to regulate your nervous system. This is a kind of biological and scientific way to talk about something that religious people have talked about using very, very different language. But I think they were talking about the same thing. And here it is. You know, evolutionary biologists remind us that the deepest part of our brains is the part of our brains that was developed by fish, amphibians, and reptiles. People often call it the reptilian brain, and they do it and they say it's bad. Oh, the reptilian brain, that's what makes you angry and afraid. Well, yeah, but it's also what makes you reproduce. That's not so bad. It's also what makes you enjoy food. It's also what makes you explore. And it's an incredibly powerful part of our brain. I call it the survival module. It's everything in our brain that develops to help us biologically survive. So fighting, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flock, and reproduce. People often talk about the 6 Fs. And some of you got that. But anyway, the survival committee is super, super important. It's super, super beautiful. I don't look at that part of our brain as the least developed or the most primitive. I look at it as the most highly developed. None of you are having to think about, keep beating heart, breathe again, breathe again. All of that just happens automatically, you know? It's the part that keeps us going, you know? It's amazing. And it's the part that helps us walk, and it's amazing. And it's interested in our survival. It's so efficient, it goes faster than the speed of thought. Like, I think you should be in awe of your survival committee. And then on top of that, mammals added a new level of the brain. And remember what's unique about mammals. They incubate the eggs inside the mother's body. And so when the baby's born, the mother produces milk. Now, when you care for a baby and you produce milk for that baby, the baby comes from your body, you have a deep attachment. To be a mammal is to have attachment, emotional, biological attachment to your children, to your mate, to the members of your herd, because many mammals are herd creatures and they run with a herd, right? To have that part of a brain is to be deeply connected with other people. Years ago, I was on a 4-day wilderness horse trail ride. And the first day we got lost, so we were on our horses for 9 hours. I'll never forget it, and never repeat it, I hope. But I mean, second day we got better and we had a great time. But by the end of the first day, here's what I knew about the horses, our 15 horses in our little herd. They didn't really care that much about us people. We were a distraction. They were paying attention to each other. You know, you start to realize every movement of the ear, every sway of the butt, every wave of the tail. They were jockeying for position. This horse liked to be next to this horse. This horse didn't want to be behind that horse. And they were into each other. And I thought, we humans are the same. And we came in this room tonight, and that part of our brain was working, looking for friendly people, people we know, people we'd like to know, people we'd rather somebody else get to know. But that's part of our brain, right? And then the meaning committee, and that's the part of our brain that looks for meaning. It works with language, it works with ideas, it has the capacities for foresight. And then people who really study the brain remind us that we have a left wing of our brain and a right wing of our brain. And the left wing is about focused attention, and the right wing is about open awareness. And when you put our brain together, that's a gross oversimplification. I'm just giving you basically 6 modules of the brain, right? But people who study this say there's well over 100, and the sophistication and interrelationships of these modules of our brain are phenomenal. But this is why some nights you can't fall asleep, because you were watching or doom scrolling or watching the news, and your survival module is thinking, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. This is horrible. And your belonging module is thinking, who can I talk to about this? If I talk to them, they won't be friends with me anymore. If I talk to them, whatever. And we're having negotiations between all the different parts of our brain. And some of them use words, and some of them have primal screams. But it's all happening so fast. And it's amazing all of us are sane and having any level of self-regulation at all. But listen, when stresses go up in human nervous systems, predictable things happen. People get meaner to each other when stress levels go up. People have an aversion to anything unfamiliar when stress levels go up. People are susceptible to authoritarianism when stress levels go up. And when we understand this, it starts, to me, helping make sense of an awful lot of things that are going on in our world. So in a time of unraveling, this becomes a time when our first reaction is often, how do I fix this? How do I fix this? We're involved with problems that you're not going to fix by tomorrow or by the next election. And so we're all going to have to get used to saying, I've got to learn to regulate my nervous system. And suddenly you understand why things like, people usually think about prayer as trying to convince God to do something for you. Like, as if God was sort of unwilling unless you can really say pretty please or whatever, right? But when you think about it, prayer is a way for human beings to say, I need help and I can't fix it myself. A lot of people don't know who to admit that to. And prayer gives you a way to admit it and to say it even with other people. The experience of gathering physical bodies together in a place, super, super important, especially, by the way, in authoritarian times, because authoritarianism tries to make everyone feel isolated and afraid so that they submit to the authoritarian leaders. And you have to get physically present with other people in order to feel safe enough to say, yeah, that's a bunch of crap and I don't believe it. But it helps to be physically present with some other people. It turns out that a lot of the practices of our faith communities to get people together and sing. Do you understand? Singing is getting your survival module to vibrate and to do it in harmony with other people and in rhythm with other people. Do you start to get a feeling how many of these practices are survival practices? And I think we're going to need them in these times, because if we don't, a lot of things are going to go wrong. So we're going to have to learn to mind our mind and pay attention to our attention and learning to be aware of our awareness. If you think of those 3 modules like committees, a survival committee, a belonging committee, and a meaning committee, we have to find ways to have a meeting of your internal board of directors. Brian, we're not doing so well here, are we? We're kind of freaking out these days, aren't we? We're snapping at people, we're withdrawing. Yeah, we got to have a talk about this. And we have an internal board of directors meeting. And we find ways to bring some calm and some focus and some regulation. And so that's the main thing I wanted to get us thinking about tonight. that we're in the midst of a challenging time. And I don't think it's going to get easier tomorrow. I think, and I'm sorry to tell you that, but I think it will help us if we are realistic. Because bigger things are going on that aren't our fault. And a lot of these things have been building for decades and centuries and even millennia. And to turn a ship around as big as human civilization, it's way harder than we wish it would be. And so the challenges that we face are going to take a while. And we need some people to stay sane in the midst of it all. And we need some people to say, I want to gather with some other people so that I won't panic, or so that I won't despair, or so that I won't start hating everybody who I think doesn't get it as much as I do. And ironically, as soon as we say this isn't going to be solved quickly, and this isn't going to be easy, I think it becomes more possible for us to actually not only survive, but actually be more fully alive. There's one last thing I want to share, and then we're going to take a break. I'm going to ask you a question, and we'll take a break. But this is a little diagram that I remember from biology class decades and decades ago. But it's a diagram that I think could help us in the meaning module part of our brain to understand how things happen in the world. This model is used to understand something, for example, like forest succession. Imagine there's a volcano and all life is wiped out in an area. And then you have some pioneer plants, lichens and little grasses, manage to get a foothold. And they live and die and live and die. And every time they live and die, they leave their detritus, compost from their leaves that begins to create soil. And then bigger plants can come. And then pioneer trees can come. And then eventually a climax forest can come. And that climax forest might exist. Here in California, you have like the world record climax forests, right? You have climax forests that have been around for, I don't know, but a long time, 1,000+ years. It doesn't happen too many places in the world, but there are places here in California where it happens. And the way that biologists talk about this and ecologists talk about this is they say nothing happens unless there's energy. So the energy and resources. So the first phase they call the exploitation phase. There's some source of energy that can be exploited. They don't mean this in a bad way. They mean it just, there's sunlight and rain, and those little plants can grow. They can exploit the sunlight and rain. And then there's sunlight and rain and soil, and the pioneer plants can grow. And there's sunlight and rain and deep soil, and the big trees can grow. And those big trees, once they get there, you understand, they're sending their roots down very, very deep, and they're building very, very big trunks. They're storing up resources so that they can survive. They're conserving their resources so they can survive. And that conservation phase can last for a long time, but eventually something happens. And I almost hesitate to show this picture just because it's in recent memory here. But one of the things that happens to forests is fires happen. And that fire happens and everything's gone. But you know what? This time it's different than the volcano, because now when all those trees die, they even leave more soil, so that when the next cycle begins with the advantages that came from the failure of the last cycle. Does that make sense? And when you think about this kind of cycle happening, then you start to understand, okay, exploitation or a growth phase, conservation phase, a stability phase, a release phase, when the old system stops working, when conditions change, when that new little pine borer beetle shows up and starts killing more of the trees, when red algae starts to proliferate, when we pump too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and destabilize the climate, it leads to a release phase, and the release phase leads to a reorganization phase. And then the next time around, it's different. And the next time around, it's different. And the next time around, it's different. We wouldn't be here if these kind of cycles hadn't happened with the first stars that were created after the Big Bang. They went through this phase too. And that created the elements that make up our bodies. And we wouldn't be here if there hadn't been many civilizations that went through this phase. And we aren't the end. This whole story didn't unfold for us. And to me, this becomes a place where, as adults, we start to face that there's something far bigger going on here than just me, my happiness, my family, my life, my career, us, just our country, our nation, our civilization, our generation that's alive when we're alive. There's something bigger going on here. Instead of saying life is about me, maybe we grow up to the point where we say, we're actually here to be about life. That feels to me like maturity. And it feels to me like what some of us are ready to learn. The kind of people who come out on a Friday night are willing to learn that. We'll take a 10-minute break and then come back together. Yeah. So when you are mingling around, you might ask somebody, what are you thinking about after that? Remember, learning isn't the consequence of teaching, learning is the consequence of thinking. What are you thinking about after that? So.
Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @WayCollective. Peace and every good, y'all.